Now we are recording.
Fabulous. Okay, great. So welcome to the 2021 version of Mercy College's International Week, right? This is, you thought you were showing up for World Philosophy Day, and you have, but this all starts with, it's all the start of, rather, a glorious week of celebration of various international days, first of which, somewhat out of order, is World Philosophy Day, which is marked here this particular year on a Monday, but in fact, usually, as per the usual, falls on next Thursday, so you want to mark your calendars for that, of course. And we have tomorrow a celebration and a discussion of World Toilet Day, featuring presentations by Professors Irina Ellison and Thomas Culhane on how the toilet changed the world and how to go forward with home and community anaerobic and processes. Right. So, and then finally, International Day of Tolerance, to be marked on the actual World Philosophy Day, with a presentation by Dr. Eduardo Albrecht and two Mercy College students on artificial intelligence and democracy, whether algorithms are inclusive of all citizens. So with that, I will turn things back to Professor Abelson, who will introduce today's event.
All right, thank you, Dr. Fisher. That talk on World Tolerance Day will dovetail nicely with what I have to say today in this panel. So that's a nice coincidence. All right, so welcome everybody to our World Philosophy Day panel. We have a great panel this time. We have Dr. Saul Fisher, who you already heard from, Associate Provost here at Mercy, and has his PhD from the CUNY Graduate Center, as I do. I'm Dr. Ben Abelson. I'm a professor of philosophy here at Mercy. We also have Dr. Joanna Smolenski, who recently minted PhD from the CUNY Grad Center, who is a clinical ethics fellow at the UCLA Health Ethics Center. You'll be hearing from her in a little while. And then we also have Dr. Dragana Bozin, associate professor from the University of Oslo. So she'll be here soon as well. But we'll get things started with Dr. Fisher.
Great. So I'm just going to share my screen. And we can get going. So, all right. I think this is going to do what I want it to do, but we'll see. And if I need to make an amendment, I shall. Right. So I'm going to talk about aesthetics, art, and value. After humanity. We're, of course, dedicating this whole version or chapter of World Philosophy Day celebration at Mercy College to the future of humanity. And as I was talking with Professor Abelson before, I think we may be going from most grim to slightly less grim, and perhaps by the end of the day, we'll have some optimistic things to say. But today doesn't start off on that great a note. Let's see if I can get this to move. No, it's not going to move that way. So let me try this. All right. Okay, for me to proceed through the slides. Okay, there we go. So here's a little overview of what we'll be up to, and that's coming out okay on your screens. It's not full screen for me.
Yeah,
it's okay for you.
Yeah,
it's okay. Right. So actually, I won't read through this in the interest of time, but I do want to note that I'll be, you'll see some background art on the slides, which are supposed to be some bowing in the direction of kind of post-apocalyptic visions of some mostly contemporary artists, though one historical exception. I guess if anyone's interested in the art, we can talk about that too. But all right, so let's just take this in order then. Oh, I see. You really don't get the full animation effect this way. All right, I'll have to figure that out some other time. Not on your time, however. So this is, by the way, I'll just say one thing about this work in the background. This is a Brooklyn-based artist. So if you look closely underneath the words, which would have been clearer had the animation worked, you'll see remnants of the Brooklyn Bridge to be contemplated at some time in the future, perhaps, but not by people, right? So we don't, so which brings me to my point here, or starting point, which is we don't really know exactly what awaits us as a species or when it's going to happen, but it's not likely anything good in the end game, right? So we might destroy ourselves through war, people generally meaning, or through environmental destruction or through population growth. We might fall victim to a pandemic. That's a familiar theme these days. There could be natural climate change. It's just not any fault of our own, but it's just sort of the way the world works, right? We could be overthrown by robots, and we'll hear perhaps some more about that in Ben's talk. Or we could be, this is one of my favorite possibilities, we could be supplanted by some successor species, it's still a hominin, you know, and we might relate to it the way the Neanderthals related to Homo sapiens, but they win and we lose, right? And at least, you know, that might give us some sense of continuity, perhaps. Now, there are a lot of other possibilities here. There's a whole range of possibilities about how Homo sapiens could come to an end, you know, which could include what are called transhuman possibilities. And those are all super interesting, but they have a kind of different side to these things. What I want to do here is I just want to assume the end. I just want to assume, you know, human beings stop existing, right? That's the, and that's where I'm going with that. So the future of humanity here is a kind of a jumping off point for me, where the assumption is actually maybe the future is not a good one, right? So, and so what I want to do, sorry, the animation really would have helped here instead of clouding up your screen here. But so let me just quickly sort of summarize what the problem is and why it's interesting, given that if humanity really ends, we're not even going to be around to see it as a problem, right? So number one, I think if we assume that we're gone, and at the same time, we assume that all, or like some substantial chunk of our art that we've made and the cultural, other kinds of cultural artifacts survive us, then us being out of the picture, there's really no one around to value that, right? But then at least some people, probably the majority of you, would say something like, well, but look, you know, something's valuable only if there's someone to associate value to the thing or appreciate the value in a thing. How all that happens, I'll go into in a moment or two. But if that's true, then it looks like all this art stuff and cultural artifacts really have no value after we're gone. And at the same time, we think it's got value now, right? Indeed, for some works of art, I don't know, pick your favorite classic work of art in whatever tradition, you know, Beethoven, or perhaps it's some gamelan musical work, or, you know, from really any tradition, you might say, well, that's got eternally lasting value, right? That's what makes it a classic, or something like that. A lot of people talk that way, and a lot of people mean it too, right? So that leaves us with really two choices, and it boils down to, you know, that if there's no one around, and that's really what having value depends on, then it looks like there really is no eternal lasting value once we're gone, or else maybe it's just wrong to talk about things having value, in particular art having value, as being dependent on whether people assign value to it. So that's the general problem that I want to explore this afternoon. And you'll see why this has some implications for both the future of humanity in terms of our own existence on this planet or elsewhere, but as well, whatever comes next. Okay, so I'll say some more about that in some moments. First, I want to indulge in a little very brief primer on what it means to talk about value in art. Okay, this, by the way, is the oldest art I'll show. It does actually have people in it, so it doesn't qualify as completely post-apocalyptic, but maybe it's getting towards the end. Right, this is a painting done by Hubert Robert in the late 18th century, featuring the Louvre Museum, which was just turned into a museum by that point. And he was the curator, I guess we would say in our terminology. And here he is depicting it in ruins, right? Predicting a grim or glum future, right? But back to the topic at hand. Okay, so what does it mean for when people say, oh, art is valuable, what do they mean, right? Well, they could simply just mean that it's got financial value, the way we talk about other material things having financial value or lacking financial value. But then there's a whole range of other kinds of value that they talk about, right? Or that we talk about, right? That, you know, art might have sentimental value. It might be a pretty bad painting, but you like it because it was your grandmother's, for example, right? There's use value or functional value, right? It might serve some purpose, right? So a very central example would be, to the extent that architecture is art, right? We want to talk about that as having a lot of use for us as well, right? It's an art with a use value to it, so is pretty much any design that we would call art or artistic. Then, you know, there's a range of cultural and historical value that people say, well, certainly the painting we're looking at now has historical value, because as I just spoke about, how we can see how a very early and important figure in the history of actually the French Revolution, as well as from a cultural perspective, as well as the history of the museum. Here's this figure, Hubert Robert, who was painting what his conception of, you know, the importance of the Louvre in French culture, or as a sign of French culture to be considered after the demise of French culture. So lots of interesting historical stuff to be said about this painting, and onward for, and on so on for other, really any art form. Lots of historical and cultural value. Aesthetic value and artistic value, I want to come back to. Suffice it to say at this point that when we talk about art as being valuable in and of itself, that's typically what we mean, but there's a lot more to be said about that. I'll come back to that in some moments. Well, actually, let me just simply say one thing about aesthetic value, which is that classically, at least in the Western philosophical tradition, when we talk about aesthetic value, we mean things like beauty, ugliness, being awe-inspiring, those sorts of things. But then it turns out there's a real range of other sorts of value that can be aesthetic. Now, most of these kinds of value, right, we get because there are people around to assess the value, right? So if you just think about standard art world terms, right? If you go to a gallery, the gallery owner has assessed the value of the painting and put a price tag on it. Okay, or we need people, let's say, to appreciate the value. So if you're a visitor to the gallery, if you're a visitor to a museum, you might be able to appreciate the value of, say, a painting or another art object that you see there. And then, you know, we as well might build on value, right, and increase value. This is back to this sort of financial piece, say, in an auction context. All right, so if there's all this kind of dependency, right, for the assignment of value, the appreciation of value, building on the value, any relationship that we have to the value, then it starts to look like, right, take away the human species and the value appears to go away as well, right? And this is the sort of thing that people say about money, for example, right? Money has value in virtue of people associating value with it. No people, money has no value. Now, if that was globally true for all the kinds of value that we attach to art, then I think it actually would be likely, if not certain, that art has no eternally lasting value, such that once people are gone, then art has indeed no value. All right, so here I want to talk about value that in fact can survive, sort of contrary to that last suggestion. And my proposal goes like this, right? There are some kinds of value that are dependent on our having attached such value, that are not dependent on our having attached such value to artworks, at least in the usual ways. Okay, so there are some kinds of value that are attached to art, as may have been attached by us, that is, we made those value assessments, and yet in those cases, I'm suggesting we would have seen, or not we, but we could, it can be detected, let me put it that way, it can be detected that there is value attached to the art, whether we make those assessments or not. Okay, so what I want to say here is that there's a comparison to be made with the way we think about just things that are true regardless of our noticing them to be true. Okay, so to the extent that the traditional view says that value is attached to art because we have some sort of experience of art, there are things in the world that pose a kind of counterexample, not related to art or value, but that turn out to, right, things that turn out to be true regardless of our not having any experiential encounter with them, right? So, the example I throw out here is, just for fun, that natural numbers are either odd or even. That's a fact about natural numbers, whether we experience them or not, such that once Homo sapiens are gone, it will remain true that natural numbers are either odd or even. Okay, so that's a little bit far afield. So let's just see, as comparisons go, what kinds of values could we assess in art that fit that sort of description? And my short version here is that although we generally think of experiencing art, assigning a value to art in ways that depend on our experiencing the art, right? We listen to a song, we judge it to be beautiful, and the beauty judgment that we assign to that song is clearly, in that case, or seems to be clearly dependent on our having listened to it, right? There's some debate in aesthetics talk about whether that's actually true, but that's at least the base case, or that's the sort of the view to criticize, right? So that view suggests that, again, aesthetic value is dependent on there being people to make the value judgment or to appreciate the value judgment, just as we saw in, say, the instances of cultural value or use value. Okay. However, while we generally come to aesthetic value judgments in virtue of experience, right, like listening to the song and judging it to be beautiful, some brands of aesthetic value are simply there for us to discover. Okay. And if people weren't around, artworks that we would judge, were human beings still around, nonetheless have the aesthetic values we're able to assess currently, because we do currently exist. Okay, so what's an example? All right, so, I wish I had asked you to close your eyes for a moment, because I was just going to describe what you actually see in front of you, which is namely it's colloquially known as Fur Cup and Saucer, a work by Meret Oppenheim from 1936, just entitled Object, but, supposed to represent a kind of cup and saucer covered in fur, as though that's the sort of thing that one would find, one would try to be able to drink out of, but in fact not, right? So this is an instance of conceptual art. What we find is that perhaps the main, or certainly extremely common aesthetic value that's associated with conceptual art is irony. But here's the thing, I didn't need to tell you, I didn't need to show you for a cup and saucer, right, for you to get the irony. I merely needed to tell you about it, right? And I could have told you about it, and I told a little story about it and who made the sculpture and such, but I didn't, sorry. Yeah, but you didn't need to actually see it in order to get that point. You didn't need to experience it, at least visually, and yet it's an artwork which most people would associate with visual experience. Okay, so the sorts of aesthetic values that I think are most likely to survive humanity, punchline here, right, are like what we find in judging conceptual art, right? What philosophers of art call cognitive aesthetic values. And those include values that are clearly going to be of a kind of mental character or cognitive character, like enlightening, insightful, disorienting, making us change our minds kind of thing, resembling the truth. But also aesthetic values that are like what the philosopher Noel Carroll calls reaction properties, by which he means to pick out values like funny or ironic or elegant, which I think also make a fairly obvious appeal to our being able to think our way, at least on one construal, think our way through the value of an artwork rather than actually experiencing it, maybe even firsthand at all. So I think these sorts of aesthetic values are likely to survive humanity because if they can be cognized, right, and they don't need to be experienced by the senses, then we could hope that, it's just a hope, I think, that advanced machines might find might be able to appreciate their aesthetic value, even though we're gone, right? Or other beings that might find them, whether it's a successor hominin or it's some creature from outer space. Again, with sufficient cognitive capacity, might be able to appreciate their aesthetic value. So it's not a promise, but it is a hope. Looking at all this, you might think, well, look, this is a narrow band of all the art that humanity has produced, right? The sort of conceptual art. It's actually all rather recent. I mean, there are historical precedents for it, but the vast bulk of conceptual art is really rather new as of the last half century or so, or century, let's say. And that's true, I would say. But I think there's a little move we can make here, which is, and I'll set this up by saying, just say, look at how in the arts and disability movement, the visual arts have been made accessible for the blind, music has been made accessible for the deaf. And what we see there are really triumphant efforts to make the arts accessible without the kinds of experience, that's the key word here, the kinds of sensory experience as are intended by the artist. It might be through, I should allow that it might be through another kind of sensation, but it also is through, right, it's a big part of the accessibility movement in the arts and arts education to have art that's accessible in a cognized way, right? Just sort of thinking about it, maybe hearing about it, someone else describe it, and then the person thinking about what that art would mean to them. All right, so I'll close with this then. What difference does any of this make, right? So I've suggested that, art might have eternally lasting value after all, right? So today we assign aesthetic value to our art that we've made as human beings. And then after the fall of humanity, that value, I believe, might continue to actually be found in the art, despite our own dim future. It could be found by others, right? And I think that, despite all the grim character of my art, the art that I'm showing, and the fate that I think awaits us, I think there's two reasons to be cheered here, two reasons to bring away some kind of happy note here, right? One is this: if some piece of the value of our art, if some aspect of the value of our art consists in its eternally lasting value, or the possibility of its eternally lasting value, which is perhaps more important here, because it's not all going to be eternally valuable, but some of it might be, right? And if that's true, right, that we get actually some sense of why it's valuable today by thinking about how it could have value forever, then we could be confident, right, that the possibility, again, of some such value may survive us, and that would add to the value of the art, or would justify our adding that kind of eternally lasting value characteristic to the value that the art holds for us today. And it might, both for motivational purposes as well as for our own sort of reflecting on what makes art important when we think it's truly significant in this kind of possibly eternally lasting way. The second piece concerns not us, but sort of who comes after human beings, and if our art survives and the value of our art survives as well for whichever cognitively rich entities come after us, then we might hope that they find our artistic output to be something important and worth cherishing as a kind of rich cultural heritage of what came before, namely people. And my question at that point is, why should we not let them enjoy our cultural and artistic output as well? And I will close with that.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Fisher. That was super interesting. If people have questions, we're gonna field questions at the end after everyone has presented. But if you don't want to forget it, you can just write it into the chat, and we'll get to it when we get to the Q&A period. All right. So I'm gonna go next. And again, as this is a panel on the future of humanity, And this will be something fairly familiar to those in my class, that I'm going to be talking about the role of artificial intelligence in humanity's future. So hopefully you can all see that. All right. The role of artificial intelligence in humanity's future. So I'm starting with this observation that AI is creepingly pervasive in our world. Artificial intelligence of various kinds continues to advance in sophistication and play potentially pivotal roles in human affairs, sometimes functioning in ways that are beyond the understanding and predictive capabilities of programmers. So here on the left, I have some stuff about Facebook algorithms and how they work. There's also the Spotify recommendation pipeline in the middle. These algorithms that govern what content we see on social media and through other applications. And people such as those who made the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, have claimed that these kinds of artificial intelligence tools, like the Facebook algorithm, are having radical effects on the way that we think, the way that we behave. Perhaps they have had some influence in our elections and things like that. And the case that's made in The Social Dilemma is the programmers themselves claim that these tools are doing things that they could not have anticipated having programmed them, that they're behaving in ways beyond the initial intentions. And so they're sort of acting on their own in a sense, in the sense that they're doing things beyond what has been predicted of them. There's more and more advancing AIs like the GPT-3 chatbot, which given the right inputs, can do a pretty good job of fooling you into thinking that you're talking to an actual person. There's a great Facebook thread where GPT-3 imitates the philosopher David Chalmers in a way that's fairly convincing. We have AI being used to assist people in various contexts. So here under GPT-3, we have the Caro bot by Fraunhofer IPA, which is used to help senior citizens and people with disabilities. And it can apparently detect owners' preferences and reflect their emotions back at them. And it's been very successful. It's the people who've used it have welcomed it and found it very helpful in helping care for them and helping them with various types of medical treatment and things like that. On the top right, you have the Ellie from Sim Sensei, which is a virtual psychiatrist. And one paper that talks about some experimental work with Sim Sensei claims that it engages psychiatric patients better than human psychotherapists. So they do a kind of Wizard of Oz thing where one group gets the actual Sim Sensei and another group gets what appears like Sim Sensei, but there's actually a human operator behind it. And the patients preferred working with the actual AI rather than the fake AI. So again, these tools are advancing and they're playing bigger and bigger roles in people's lives. There's also Google Translate, which depends on AI neural networks in order to function. Self-driving cars. There's a huge ethical debate about how self-driving cars should be programmed, whether to protect the driver or to protect the public, other drivers or pedestrians. And so in the future of humanity, there is a huge debate over how this AI should work. And it seems like more and more, whether driving, pursuing therapy, looking at social media, more and more of our choices are being offloaded to AI. AI is having more and more influence in deciding what we see, how perhaps we may behave, if it's a psychiatric intervention or something like that, we might wonder how we should feel about this. Should we welcome this, the rise of AI as playing this kind of decision-making role in our lives, or should we resist it? All right, and some theorists, such as Ray Kurzweil, predict that once AI learns to upgrade itself, there will soon follow an explosion of superintelligence known as the singularity, at which point AI will far outpace human intelligence by many orders of magnitude. So if it's playing this major role in our lives now, just imagine what will happen once it is much, much, much more sophisticated than our brains. We might wonder what it will do with us, whether it will care about us at all, whether it will work toward our benefit, or whether it will enslave us in some sort of way. So if this is really, singularity is really going to happen, should we try to hold it off? Or again, should we embrace it? Should we lean in to artificial superintelligence? Now, why would we do that? Well, we face these horrible global problems, poverty, pandemics like COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, all of these issues that it seems like human governance is not really working well at combating, at dealing with, right? It seems like on a national level or a global level, our leaders are failing to meet the challenges to humanity, these grave challenges to humanity. So maybe we should welcome our digital overlords and try to get them to solve our problems for us, given that it seems like we can't do it ourselves. Well, maybe, maybe not, right? Because there are these kinds of nightmare scenarios depicted in movies and TV where the machines take over and they are malevolent. Or they might be benevolent on the face of it, but their benevolence is misguided in some horribly tragic way. So for instance, sorry, I see something in the chat. Yes, like the Matrix, exactly, Tatiana. Here on the left, we have the AI, the agent AIs from the Matrix, right? In the Matrix, the machines trap humanity in a illusory, seemingly virtual world and use us, exploit our bodily energy to keep themselves running. In the film I Am Mother from the Matrix, not from the Matrix, on Netflix, the image is in the middle of the AI in I Am Mother, who is programmed to extend the life and to benefit the human race, but decides that the human race is hopelessly corrupt, and given a cache of embryos, decides to kill the remaining humans in the world and restart the human race one embryo at a time by trying to provide each one with an ideal education that would make them into an ideal moral agent. And then the question, of course, is whether this kind of utilitarian ends justified the means kind of reasoning is really ethically correct, right? Is really just. Is there a point that humanity might get to where the right thing to do is to wipe the slate clean and start over? That is what the mother AI in this case is programmed to do, but it seems like from the perspective of actual current living humans, a nightmare situation. Similarly, in the film I, Robot, the AI Vicky, based on Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, is programmed also to benefit humanity, to extend the human race and protect it. And Vicky decides that the best way of doing that is to take any kind of agency and control away from us, because otherwise we will doom ourselves. So very similar theme here, where we can't take care of ourselves, so the AIs will do it for us, but maybe not in ways that we would accept. Now, the question is, well, could we program an ethical AI to make decisions for us in a way that is moral or ethical, in a way beyond what we're capable of doing? Well, on the bottom right, I have just the headline from an article that says an ethical AI trained on human morals has turned racist. The software Ask Delphi was trained on people's moral judgments on the internet, and it very quickly started making unacceptable judgments about people. And so we might wonder, well, we're not going to do it in a democratic way and just take everyone's moral judgments as inputs, because it doesn't look like, then we're going to get the same result, unfortunately, that it looks like we might get just from regular democracy. So how could we program the AI in order to make the kinds of judgments that we'd want it to? Susan Lee Anderson, in her article, Asimov's 3 Laws of Robotics and Machine Metaethics, says, well, ethical theory has not advanced to the point where there is agreement, even by ethical experts, on the correct answer for all ethical dilemmas. An autonomous machine that's expected to be moral, on the other hand, would either not be able to act in such situation or would decide arbitrarily, whether between, say, a utilitarian kind of algorithm or a Kantian algorithm where there's, exceptionless ethical rules. It seems like the answers that we're going to get are going to depend on what ethical theory you endorse. And so it's still going to come down to who's programming the thing, unless we're able to develop AIs that have preferences of their own, that have certain basic kinds of concerns and values that drive their decision making. And again, we might wonder whether those are the same as ours or not, but a lot of the question here might come down to whether we can have conscious artificial intelligences. Artificial intelligences for whom there is something that it is like to be them, that they have genuine experiences, that they feel things, that things look and sound and taste a certain way to them. The kind of machines that Dr. Fisher suggested might be the ones to appreciate our artworks after we're gone. But as Susan Schneider makes the case in her book, Artificial You, AI and the Future of You, conscious machines, if they exist at all, may occur in certain architectures and not in others. And they may require a deliberate engineering effort. So we might make choices about whether to create conscious AIs or not. One reason to worry about doing that is, the rights and the concerns of that new conscious being that you've created, which is now going to be sort of at the service of humanity. But on the other hand, it might be good to make it conscious because, as Dr. Schneider says, the value that an AI places on us may hinge on whether it believes it feels like something to be us. This insight may require nothing less than machine consciousness. So it might be that if the machines are conscious, they'll recognize us as other conscious beings and then maybe think that it's important to consider our interests rather than just annihilating us or ignoring us altogether. But there's, that's a big question of whether we could have machines that are like that. Now, another option, instead of sort of just giving the power over to the machines, if we want to keep up with them, if we want to be able to understand these tools that are so pervasive in our society, maybe we should merge with AI and in some way become AI ourselves, become cyborgs, like the DC superhero Cyborg here on the top left. Elon Musk and his Neuralink project is already working on computer chips that could be implanted in our brains in order to enhance our cognitive abilities in various ways. Or at the extreme end of this, we might do something like in the Black Mirror episode San Junipero here in the middle and upload entirely to the cloud. to the point where we would cease to be physical beings altogether and but would persist as computer programs ourselves. We would become just AIs. So there are those various possibilities, and these are sort of the so-called transhumanists are very enthusiastic about these possibilities. They think that they should be investigated. As the first bullet point here says in their declaration, humanity stands to be profoundly affected by science and technology in the future. We envision the possibility of broadening human potential by overcoming aging, cognitive shortcomings, involuntary suffering, and our confinement to planet Earth. And they recognize that there are some potential issues with this, but in general, they're optimistic about it. But some reasons for caution about merging with AI. As Dr. Schneider puts it herself, she wonders, would enhancement or uploading preserve consciousness? If we start replacing parts of our brains or even our entire corporeal self with AI, will we still be conscious at all? Will we still be sentient beings? Will there still be something that it is like to be us? Will we still be persons? Would enhancement or uploading preserve personal identity? If we are persons, would we be the same person after going through enhancement or uploading? Other kinds of considerations. Who would have access to individual software, right? If we're worried about the Facebook algorithm manipulating us, imagine what it will be like if programmers can get directly into our minds by hacking our implants, or stealing. You're worried about stealing our data. Imagine them stealing our actual thoughts. Is that a challenge to free will or mental privacy? And would inequality be exacerbated by enhancement or uploading possibilities, right? So if these things are only really available to the very rich, then we, as stratified as our society already is, it could become radically more stratified if only the very rich are able to enhance. So I'll leave you with just some very tentative conclusions. First, it seems like one idea that Anderson suggests is AI should be developed as ethical advisors to humans rather than ethical agents or decision makers themselves. Caution should be used in developing ever more advanced AIs and unleashing them onto society, as well as in developing invasive cognitive enhancement technology. Humans must continue to work on solving our own problems rather than offloading them onto AI, if that's possible, right? And we might consider different other ways to organize society. Yuval Noah Harari has some ideas in a recent article. And finally, and this is something that I think Dr. Bozin later is going to pick up on, philosophical and ethical reasoning is crucial for whatever decisions we end up making about the role of AI in human life. And so I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Moving on in the panel, I've been talking about ways humanity might be transformed by artificial intelligence, but there are other ways that we may be transformed as a species, and Dr. Smolenski will pick it up from there. Let me spotlight you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Abelson. Let me just share my screen here. All right, everyone can see this? Okay, fabulous. So that was actually a great segue from Dr. Abelson, because it really, I think he ends his talk with the importance of philosophical and ethical thinking when we think about the future of humanity. Because a lot of these kinds of innovations that we're talking about today are potential realities that humanities are going to live in, kind of exist in an extra legal space. So there aren't laws yet that are telling us what's right or wrong. So kind of in the absence of law, we have to step in and think about, well, what's consistent with our moral priorities? And I'm going to be talking about that from the perspective of medical interventions and specifically genetic editing. So my general plan is going to be to first start with some definitions, tell you what I mean when I talk about editing the genome and why someone might want to do this. And then I'm going to sort of look at why people might have said that CRISPR-Cas9 is a kind of holy grail for medical care. And in talking about that, I'll consider where we might use CRISPR. So the difference between modifying somatic cells, for instance, and germline cells. And here I'm going to suggest that we should consider there to be an ethical bright line between these two types of modifications. And I'll approach that through using a case study that I call the Chinese CRISPR twins. And so you'll see a little bit what I mean by that. But I think that that case study really shows the potential harms associated with moving forward in this kind of medical treatment. And those are harms that are associated with both informed consent and sort of general unnecessary harm when relevant to the benefit. And then we can sort of spend a little bit of time thinking about the future of germline research and how we want to proceed. So when I'm talking about editing the genome is an organism's complete set of DNA, including all of its genes. So each genome contains all of the information needed to build and maintain that organism. So that's what we're talking about, potentially being able to modify. And when we're modifying it, we're going to be engaging in genetic engineering, which is an umbrella term for a wide range of techniques by which scientists can add genetically determined characteristics to cells that would not otherwise have possessed them. And there are a number of different technologies that have been used to perform genetic engineering in the past. But the one that I'm really going to focus on here is the last bullet on this list, CRISPR-Cas9. And I will say now, I'm not a geneticist, so if you have sort of deep questions about how the science here works, I'm probably not the best person to ask. But the general kind of layman's summary of how CRISPR works is that it actually relies on RNA-DNA base pairing rather than the engineering of proteins that bind particular DNA sequences. So it's often described as functioning like a pair of molecular scissors that can be guided by RNA to cut DNA at a specific point in a cell. And what's the value of this? Why would anyone want to do this kind of thing? Well, there are a lot of actual uses that could potentially CRISPR could be mobilized for. So one, for instance, is diagnosis. So using CRISPR, a platform called Sherlock has been developed that is literally exact 1 million times better at detecting specific viral strains like Zika and dengue than currently the most common alternative. So that gives us a 1 million time improvement in diagnostic precision. It can also be potentially used to treat, eliminate, or prevent disease. So as of 2015, so that's already been, 6 years, there's been clinical development ongoing for HIV/AIDS, hemophilia, sickle cell anemia, and some cancers. And actually what we've seen is that we have been able to use genome editing technology to do what has seen to be unthinkable in the past, namely have someone fully recover from terminal cancer. So here we have 1-year-old Layla Richards, who was suffering from what would have been considered a terminal leukemia. And she was treated using genome editing tech. So scientists in London edited genes in immune cells to make them, in kind of common parlance, hunt down and destroy the malignant blood cells that threatened her life. And she became the first person in the world to make a full recovery from terminal cancer using designer immune cells. So that's a pretty amazing kind of step forward when we're thinking about the future of humanity. To be able to cure cancer, literally using these kinds of techniques, would represent a very substantial progress. I mean, in fact, this was so kind of important as a discovery that as of July of this year, the WHO has reported that there are currently over 150 gene editing studies with human subjects occurring around the world. So we're looking for ways that we can continue to develop this technology and keep doing exactly these types of things. So this is another example. So Layla Richards was in London. In New York, Dieter Egli was a developmental biologist at Columbia University, and he's been working on CRISPR to see if it can safely repair a genetic defect that causes an inherited form of blindness. So this could enable people who were born blind to have genetically related children that are not themselves born with the same kind of deficit. And this is some more information about that we can just skip over. But also in addition to in humans, another way that CRISPR can be really useful is in what are called gene drives. So gene drives are ways that we can modify genes that can alter actual populations. And so here the thought is that we could use gene drives to potentially reprogram mosquito genomes. And in doing that, we could maybe eliminate malaria. Right. So if you imagine if you could introduce a gene into an environment that had a lot of malaria, a lot of vectors for malaria in the mosquito population, well, if we could render all of those mosquitoes infertile, for instance, then they're not going to be able to transmit the malaria onto the next generation of mosquitoes. And in fact, that could be a way that we could eliminate malaria from that region without having to worry about a malaria vaccine or doing anything really that is an involvement with the people directly. So there are a lot of possibilities here. And so kind of to sum them all up, well, why I think that CRISPR might be a holy grail in medical care? Well, for one, it's simple. Right. So whereas other kinds of genetic tools have relied on traditional reproductive models or mouse models, using this RNA DNA pairing, CRISPR can introduce modifications directly into embryos. So it's a lot more straightforward than other kinds of tools that have been used in the past. It's also much less expensive. So whereas other techniques have cost upwards of $5,000 per use, CRISPR can be as inexpensive as $30, which you can also imagine, especially when we think about how much sort of socioeconomic inequality there is in medicine, right? If this is a way that we can do this kind of work and it's comparably inexpensive, that could also increase access in addition to generating more opportunities for research. It could increase efficiency. Right. So so that efficiency could come either from the diagnostic precision that CRISPR enables, right? So instead of waiting for people to get sick and then treating their illnesses, if we could use CRISPR to diagnose them, then we might stop them from ever getting sick in the first place. Or CRISPR could serve as the vehicle for intervention that cures the relevant illness all at once, instead of subjecting individuals to long-term treatments. And kind of going along with that last point there, CRISPR could also be less burdensome, right? So thinking back to the cancer example, the best treatments currently for a lot of cancers are painful chemo and radiation. And often chemo and radiation aren't even successful, right? They have limited efficacy and high rates of recurrence. So if we could just eliminate cancer using CRISPR, that could potentially minimize suffering and lead to better lives. So you might think, okay, well, so what's the problem? This all sounds great. And I'm going to suggest the problem kind of comes in when we think a little bit more fine-grained. So if you've heard about CRISPR in the past, the conversation about it in public tends not to distinguish between what we're using potentially CRISPR to modify. So CRISPR can modify two different types of cells. On the one hand, somatic cells, and on the other, germline cells. So when we use CRISPR to modify a somatic cell, that's importantly distinct from a germline modification because somatic gene modification does not alter the genetic makeup of future generations. So basically what it does is CRISPR is used to make changes to enough of the cells carrying whatever the dangerous mutation is into an organism that could then provide basically a one and done treatment for that particular organism, right? So you can see this as being a kind of one and done treatment for a particular patient. But on the other hand, germline cells are going to be the ones that are resulting in heritable changes that affect future offspring. So when you modify a germline cell, what you're then doing is making that change the kind of change that's going to be inherited by all future generations, right? So this, I think, is a very important moral distinction. And so in the interest of time, I'll move through some of these factual slides a little bit more quickly here. But one reason to think that this is an important distinction is because currently the world agrees about it, right? So of the world's countries that have laws in place about inheritable genetic modification, it's prohibited by law or measures having the force of law in every case, right? So there isn't a jurisdiction in the world that says, hey, let's go move forward with germline gene editing. Germline gene editing is okay. And people have really just continued to double down on this kind of view over time as gene editing and genetic engineering has become more robust and better developed. So in March 2019, an international cohort of experts called on a global moratorium on heritable genome editing. And in July of this year, the WHO convened a committee of experts that again called on the nations of the world to set stronger limits on powerful methods of human gene editing to prevent rogue science experiments with the human genome. So what we have here is basically international consensus that says, okay, this technology is powerful, it's scary, and there's a lot that can be done with it. So we really need to push the brakes. And why is it important that we have this kind of international consensus? Well, this is particularly important because of reproductive travel. So what you might think, right, is that people who have means, right, if they want to pursue a particular kind of, let's say, medical treatment, and that treatment is illegal in their home countries, well, if you have the money, right, then you can travel to a jurisdiction where someone will do that for you, right? So the fact that something is, let's say, illegal in the United States, but suppose it's legal in Indonesia, if you're wealthy in the United States, you can fly to Indonesia and get that procedure done, right? So the fact that there are different laws in different countries isn't actually a disincentive for people who have means to travel. And in fact, as the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Medicine noted, medical tourism means that germline editing will be impossible to control completely if the technical capabilities exist in more permissive jurisdictions. What we basically need is a world policy on this, because if there's any kind of rogue outlier, then what that's going to do is sort of allow basically those who have money to gain access to technology, even if most of the world wants that to be prevented. And so here I'll use an example of where this technology actually was used in China. And this is allegedly the first time that CRISPR has been used to result in live human births. And this is a scientist by the name of He Jiankui from the Southern University of Science and Technology, who has been suspended. And in fact, he's gone missing, which should be a little bit suspicious at this point. But he said that he used CRISPR to edit the DNA of 7 embryos being used for fertility treatment, and that this resulted in the birth of a set of twin girls. And the goal here was to use CRISPR to delete the embryo's CCR5 gene, which is linked to resistance to HIV infection. So once he did this, this caused basically a massive international outcry. An open letter signed by 120 scientists, mostly in China, decried this research, saying that basically there was no biomedical ethics review for this kind of research, and conducting direct human experiments using CRISPR on germline cells could only be described as crazy, and that basically what he did was open Pandora's box. And now what we have to do as a society is try to close it. But again, there's a limited time frame, right? Because once this gets out, then what that does is sort of incentivizes more and more people to pursue this kind of work. And why be worried about this? Why think that this is such a big issue? Well, I'm really going to only focus on one of these. Again, this ended up being a much longer PowerPoint than I have time for. But the one thing that I'll really focus on here is informed consent. And informed consent is something that's really important and is required, in fact, from subjects that participate in experimental research in order to ensure that the subjects understand what the potential risks and benefits are of that research. So when we're getting someone to do something new and potentially dangerous, we really want to make sure that they understand what's going on. And we can't use coercion or ignorance to obtain participants, even if we think that the work that we're doing is really socially beneficial. And so one of the issues with germline gene editing, right, is that, well, what is it that we're editing here? Or we're editing embryos, but the only way that we're going to be able to find out whether the germline modification actually worked is once we transfer and implant the modified embryo. And also once we study that embryo, right? Once we look at it in the long term to see how the modification impacted the life of the resulting person. So it seems that once we've done this work at the embryonic level, then it's committing the future person in question to ongoing monitoring throughout their lives and plausibly the lives of their children as well. Because remember, one of the important distinctions between germline gene editing and somatic gene editing is that germline edits are inheritable. So we want to see, did this get inherited, right? So as Dr. Kiran Musunuru put it, the implications go beyond just these twins. These babies were treated as subjects in a grand medical experiment, and we have to believe that they will be studied for the rest of their lives. And so here, just to kind of put a point on the difference here, there was actually another study done a year later with a 27-year-old patient, also using CRISPR gene editing, with the same purpose. So both of these studies took place in China. Both of them used CRISPR to modify human genes. And in fact, both of them used CRISPR to modify the same gene, namely CCR5. And both of them wanted to modify CCR5 with the intention of generating HIV resistance. However, in the case of Lulu and Nana, this modification occurred at the germline level. And in the case of this 27-year-old patient, it was at the somatic level. So what does that mean? Well, that means that we were able to obtain informed consent from the 27-year-old patient, and that the experimental work complied with all standard ethical protocols. And it also means that no one in the international community heard about this experiment because it was basically exactly like all of the other medical experiments that go on every day, right? This just seems like part and parcel of the kind of medical research that we do. Whereas, because the target of modification in the Lulu and Nana case was this embryo that needed to be implanted, you could not gain informed consent from the subject. It could not comply with standard ethical protocols. And in fact, it ended up being an international headline that led to jail time and fines on the part of the researchers. So my suggestion here is that actually informed consent is doing a lot of work in kind of determining what it is that we're allowed to permit to happen, not only to us, but to future generations. And I've talked too long already, so I'll just end it there. But with the sort of general kind of conclusion that when we're thinking about the future of medical care and of technology in medicine, we can't just rely on the law, because again, the law is something that usually comes after the research, right? So we can have general laws about research, but when it comes to implementation, there are a lot of things that can happen in a sort of extra legal way. And what we really need to do is probe our ethical and philosophical reasoning in order to help determine what priorities this work is going to be consistent with. So thank you again for your time.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Smolenski, for that very fascinating, provocative talk. We're closing out the panel with Dr. Dragana Bozin, who is here, is in Washington, D.C. at the moment. right? But it's from the University
Yes,
of
as a matter
Oslo.
of fact, at departure gate
Oh, wow.
at
Well,
the
thank you
airport.
so much for finding the time to be with us today. And
Would you allow me to share the screen?
oh, yes, yes, I will make you co-host. Find you here. There you go. You should have.
Okay, trying now. Yes. So I am very glad that I made it. It was touch and go for a while. When I started thinking about the topic, the future of humanity, it struck me that when I was where some of you are, that is in college, we did not have to think so much about even our own future, let alone the future of the world. The future was something distant. It was strolling along at a leisurely pace. It felt like we had all the time in the world to figure things out. The future these days seems to be arriving at an uncomfortable speed. It is a topic of many scientific and newspaper articles, even daily conversations. During lunch at my department the other day, we discussed where we should be in the world. That is, where would be the safest place to be in the world if worse comes to worst. 4 decades ago, when I was in college, this conversation would have been considered a science fiction. But today, it is a very possible future. So it is against this backdrop that I wondered, what is it that philosophy, or philosophy of science rather, which is the field that I'm researching in, can do for the future of humanity, if anything at all. So I will start from the past before I move to the future. Philosophy has been around for a very, very long time before all other sciences, except perhaps mathematics, if it is a science, or rather other sciences were part of philosophy to begin with. And for the most of its existence, philosophy had been what we call an armchair philosophy. Philosophers try to figure out the world from a safe distance. During the Enlightenment, 17th century circa, philosophy and science parted their ways. What sent science and philosophy in different directions, and what also was what created the modern sciences, was the experiment. Experiment made an important difference. Until then, until 17th century, observation was the main tool for acquiring knowledge about the world. Introduction of experiment opened for possibility of going beyond what was given through passive observation. As long as we only observe the world, the sun revolves around the earth and the earth is pretty much flat. But once we start asking questions about what we observe, once we start measuring, making hypotheses and testing, dropping stones from the towers, developing new knowledge becomes possible. So from this point on, science was propelled into what it is today. Philosophy took its own path, remaining comfortably in the armchair. And so did philosophy of science. When it appeared on the scene, which was at the start of the last century, Yes, remain comfortably in the chair. So this was the slide I was expecting to pop up. Philosophy of science started with the philosophers and scientists in the Vienna Circle who started discussing what it is that defines science. They try to describe the scientific method, because once we know what the scientific method is, we can distinguish between the science and non-science. But the task of defining scientific method turned out to be quite difficult. And that was for a simple reason, that scientific development is rather messy. To make the long story short, new development started from the 60s with Thomas Kuhn and his idea that scientific progress is not as straightforward as logical positivists, that is Vienna Circle, would have it, and that progress happens through paradigm shifts. Continuing later with the influx of feminist philosophy, these things paved the way for a more engaged philosophy of science that we have today.
Sorry, Rosen, I hate to interrupt you, but we're not seeing your slides. I don't think you saw, so I don't know.
Well, it says here that I am sharing my slides.
Yeah, we see just a blank screen. The slides aren't advancing from the first one.
Okay. I have no idea why that happens, which is a pity because I have really lovely slides. I can try perhaps to stop sharing and try again, but it might be that the bandwidth is rather bad here. So let me try stop share.
In the chat, we have the suggestion to press F5.
F5, okay.
Oh, now I see the Kuhn slide.
Okay. Well,
I hope it works from here.
but do you see this one?
Yes.
Okay. So, well, this was the slide that was supposed to show how science is messy. I rather liked it. Okay, so we came to Kuhn, but I forgot what I was saying. Okay, so with Kuhn and his paradigm shift and coupled with the developments in feminist philosophy, these things paved the way for a more engaged philosophy of science that we have today. Oh, yes. So the sentence I was about to say was that gradually in the process, topics of research in philosophy of science shifted more and more towards current problems in the world. Philosophy of science today is highly engaged with what matters in the world now, like climate change and skepticism towards science, COVID pandemic, to mention a few. Philosophers of science are working on bringing science closer to the community. Some of them are you seeing a new slide now? Some of them are engaged with communities in the most vulnerable parts of the world with respect to climate change, like Galapagos Islands. And it would not be accurate to describe the work philosophers of science do today as armchair philosophy. So we have come so far, but not far enough, which brings me to the point I want to make today. Philosophy of science has much to say and has said much about many burning issues, but most of the time, these insights still remain within its borders. I think the future of the humankind could benefit, maybe a tiny little bit, but still benefit, if we, in philosophy of science, try to make the the philosophical expertise, the theories we come up with actionable in a slightly different way than the examples mentioned before, like, for example, Galapagos, which is amazing, really. So how can this be done? Here is an example. Norway, where I live, signed the Paris Agreement and committed to reduce greenhouse emissions by 40% by 2030. But we are not doing so well. There are many challenges that Norwegian society faces in reaching this target. One of these challenges is insufficient engagement of its citizens. Now, the polls place climate change deniers at about 10%, which is not particularly good. But what is more worrisome in my mind is that a large number of people, more than 50%, express various forms of uncertainty about various aspects of climate change. I call them fence sitters or potential fence sitters because these uncertainties are likely to prevent them from actively engaging with climate change issues. So engagement, increasing engagement among citizens can be positively affected through communication, climate change communication and climate science communication. And the Norwegian Meteorological Institute is the main governmental body responsible for communicating the information about climate change to the public. Philosophy on its side can contribute with new perspectives on climate science communication through expertise not on communication exactly, but on issues that connect to communication, like how science works, how to reason about science, how we acquire knowledge, how we form beliefs, how we assign a level of trust to those beliefs, and so on. So, working together, I have partnered with the Meteorological Institute trying to make some experiments in working together. We plan to make philosophical theories actionable. So we designed a process where insights from philosophy relevant for communication are remolded to be useful in planning communication strategies. And then we would test them in communication. The process would, we hope, generate further research in our respective fields and at the same time, perhaps solve a minuscule piece of the giant climate change jigsaw puzzle. A few more words without sharing the screen. So I'm not saying that all the research in philosophy of science could or should be made actionable in this manner. I'm not saying that only what is actionable is valuable. I argue that making philosophy actionable should be done where it can be done, and that this perspective should be integral part of the way we approach our research. We publish or perish, and in the process, we generate enormous amount of research in philosophy of science and philosophy in general, loads of papers. But in these, as I perceive them, all hands on deck times, I wonder what it is all worth if we do not try at the same time to make a difference where difference can be made. So this is what I think philosophy can do for the future of mankind, humankind. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Bozin. That was very challenging and important idea and argument that you're making here. So we don't have a ton of time for questions, but we have about 10 minutes. I'm going to go through the chat backwards, I think. So Dr. Regina Gibson asks, I believe, of Dr. Bozin, is most of the pollution caused by oil and chemical companies? If so, the country should be communicating with them because they operate on a business for profit model.
I think I don't know much about that side, but I'll tell you what's happening in Norway. It's much more complicated picture than that. Norway, well, we are not doing great, but we are not doing so bad about making less emissions in Norway, while at the same time we are selling oil to the countries that continue to pollute. So we need to be talked to as well, not just countries that are polluting. So it's a very complicated relationship between who is the bad guy in this sense.
Another question from Dr. Gibson, this time for Dr. Smolenski. How much testing of germline interventions has been done on animals? Have these tests been publicized in the medical journals?
Yeah, so there has been some of this work done on animals, and in particular, you'll see that gene drives are the target actually of intervention is animals. And so there was a lot of public press about this work around the time when Zika became sort of really a formidable threat, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. Because the thought was that we can use actually CRISPR gene drives in order to do this germline gene editing on mosquitoes and prevent the spread of Zika. And that was actually done in a community in Florida. And there's been a lot of really interesting feedback about, what does it take to get consent from a community for the introduction of these genetically modified organisms. But I think if you're interested in seeing how some of that has been put into practice, the best place to start looking would be with mosquitoes and gene drives.
All right, a question, I suppose, for myself from Ryan Miglio on the topic of AI. Very interesting to see how far AI has progressed. My only thought is, how would it be possible for AI to develop a consciousness? Other than this, on multiple levels, AI has been very efficient on NGO initiatives, collaborating with member states on UN agreements, specifically with monitoring, verification, and reporting systems. I feel like policy tailored to the private sector could limit the creepy data selling services. That's really interesting. I don't know that much about the work with AI with the UN and NGOs. I'd be very interested to see more about that. Whether the private sector would do any better protecting our minds from potential invasiveness, I don't know. I mean, Facebook has not done very well with protecting our data and things like that. Some companies have done better. I guess that's sort of again depends on who's going to be in charge. But I don't know if I would be happy with either government or business being responsible for protecting my mind from hacking. As far as developing AI consciousness, that's the big question mark. We really have no idea. We don't really understand how consciousness works in human beings yet, even. So we are probably a ways off from having conscious AIs as far as we know. Before I have a question for Dr. Fisher. So it seemed like what you were saying was that the value that art can have after we're all gone is tied to its potentially being found and observed by other sentient beings, whether other species or AIs or something like that. were you saying that there isn't sort of like a view from nowhere value to art that might remain even if there's no one to see it or experience it, or is it contingent on there being
Yeah.
experience?
No, that's a great question. No, I think I was a little bit ambiguous about precisely that, and I also was sort of flying through at rapid pace in my usual New York style. I think that I was trying to suggest that there's a view from nowhere, right? I mean, that's the point of making the comparison with, sort of the non-experiential access that we might have to a variety of kinds of knowledge that I think includes what the value is in art. So yeah, that there'd be any experiencers in the future, I don't think is a necessary condition for. It's not something that has to be in place in order that art would retain its value. I mean, we could still ask, okay, value for whom? And then the answer would be, well, no one yet or no one now. But so here's another way to think about this in terms of just like a timeline, right? So let's say that here's a great example, Pompeii, right? So Pompeii is largely, it's still under, it's still an archaeological dig, and there were many years when there wasn't much to be seen, if anything. I don't know the particular historical details there, but certainly over the years, there's been much more that's been uncovered. Very recently, there was a great deal of Pompeii that was uncovered. And what we want to say about Pompeii, I think, in its heyday, before Mount Vesuvius blew, right, was that it was a beautiful city with all of its various statuary and whatever else, artistic and architectural features it had. So high level of that value of beauty. Then Vesuvius, or is it Vesuvius or Etna? Actually, right. In any case, the volcano blows. Right, volcano blows, and the whole place is covered in its entirety, disappears. And now that we uncover it, we see, oh, gee, look at this beautiful, piece of antiquity, or like vast, urban landscape from past times, and we have no trouble assigning that value to it. And so you've got this giant, right, this great time period in between when it was covered, and no one was looking at it and saying, oh, this is beautiful. And my suggestion is, it wasn't the case that in that interim period, before it started to be uncovered, it stopped being beautiful, right? That it lost its value somehow, right? So that's really the sort of the piece that I think might be helpful in seeing this, not just in terms of, us being gone, but whether we have access to the works all told.
Okay, thank you. Really interesting issue there. One last question. We only have a couple minutes. Vola asked for me, is trying to predict, prevent, and resolve conflicts with the help of AI ethical? What level of AI should we allow for such tasks in order to avoid a nightmare scenario of humanity being subjected by machines? Would it also work, or is it as doomed as trying to predict, prevent, and resolve conflicts ourselves? I mean, that's the big question. That's really what I was trying to raise here, and I don't know if I have any definite answers at all. We're working on specific issues with what AIs should be like if they're going to help us. So, for instance, I was just reading a paper draft by Dr. Elisabetta Sergiovanni, who was on the panel last year, and Dr. Smolenski and I have collaborated with in the past. And she was considering the role of empathy in AIs used for medical diagnostics and things like that, of empathy. And the assumption was, well, look, it's got to have empathy if it's going to be an effective and an ethical supplement to diagnostic work in the medical field. But Dr. Sergiovanni was arguing that actually empathy specifically seems to be not so helpful, that really doctors need to develop a kind of reserved kind of distance from their patients. They need to be sympathetic to some extent, maybe compassionate, but feeling the feelings of their patients isn't necessarily helpful. So she was arguing that that's not really something that we're going to need in the AI either, or would be desirable. But that's just one tiny facet of this very complex issue. So yeah, there's a lot to think about there. All right, we've reached 4:30. So thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you to Michiko Kuroda and the Center for Global Engagement. And thank you everyone who attended. I hope that you found this enlightening. So happy World Philosophy Day on Thursday, the day that it actually falls on. And I hope you all have a great week. My class, Philosophy Through Film, stay on the call. And
Take care.
Thanks everybody for your attention. Have a great rest of your day.
Ben, I guess you could stop recording.
Oh yeah.
Take care now.